So without further ado, let me introduce you to my colleagues that will be the speakers today. Amory Jondane, he is the Senior Director of Solutions Engineering. Amory has been with Enside for the last 7 years and is one of our experts in clinical supply optimization. Joining him will be Jake Levine, Clinical Supply Optimization Solutions Engineer. Jake has worked at Enside for nearly 2 years. Jake started as a consultant with Enside, working to help biotech and pharmaceutical companies streamline their clinical supply chain. Now, as a solutions engineer, Jake is looking to spread his knowledge and help with new pharma partners enhance their supply chain visibility. So as we go through today, we hope you will find this information informative and in some ways specific to help with challenges you may have today. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Jake.
Thanks, Peggy. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. So to start off, let me give you a bit of an agenda of what we'll be diving into. The first of which, I'll be taking care of the urgency of sustainability. There, we're going to look at the emissions, ethics, and resource management associated in the clinical supply industry. Then Amory will take over, dive into the technology aspect, how we can compare it to other industries, and then dive into some case studies with our solution in particular. Last but not least, we're going to do a wrap-up session. As Peggy mentioned, please don't hesitate to put any questions in the chat that you may have, and then we'll answer all those questions then. So to get started, here on your screen, you'll see the challenges that we face in sustainability in the clinical supply industry. First, we'll take a deep dive into the emissions factors, the manufacturing, transportation, and destruction, and how that all contributes to your carbon footprint. Then I'll dive into the ethics side. What do I mean by ethics? Basically ensuring that patients are receiving their drugs as safely, timely, and quickly as possible in order to fix themselves. And last but not least, we're going to look at the resource management side of things. There, we're going to dive into drug shortages, potential COVID-19 implications, and a little comparison with another industry to help you digest all of our data a little bit better. So with the emissions factors first, before we get into the big picture of things, we have to first understand the supply chain of things. And we have to understand what the clinical supply industry looks like. So on your screen, you'll see that we cover everything from the raw materials extraction all the way to the destruction of potential waste. Starting with the raw materials extraction and mining, for the purpose of this study, we're looking at how to extract and deplete the resources from the earth, but this can also be in terms of plasma. We could be looking at blood from other patients and so on and so forth. Regardless, when we're depleting these Earth's natural resources, we're also looking at potential other factors that may influence your carbon footprint. The first of which being maybe gasoline to fuel your machinery, or electricity to keep the lights on, and so on and so forth. As we move downstream through the supply chain, each little dot in between the bubbles represents the transportation associated with each. And each bubble is a particular step in the supply chain that also contributes to the carbon footprint. Looking at the primary packaging, we might have, yes, we have the drug already in place, but we also need additional materials to actually package the drug and then transport it to the secondary packaging and so on and so forth. Once we reach the distribution phase of this study, we tend to see that of the 100% of the drugs that were brought here, 60 to 70% of them go to waste. So not only are 60% of the drugs just going in the garbage, but also the carbon emissions that happen upstream are also just being thrown to waste. Once these drugs are in the trash, there's additional carbon footprint measures that also contribute to your carbon footprint. So these drugs are burned, melted, or buried, all contributing to negative factors into the world. Again, the clinical supply industry, the healthcare industry contributes to 4.5% of the worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, which is about 27.5 million tons of greenhouse gases. To give you a little bit of perspective on what this looks like, this is greater than Denmark as a whole's carbon footprint. Obviously, this is a priority for the pharmaceutical industry. They don't want to have this negative light over them. So on your screen, you'll see that some of the major conglomerates have already taken measures to go carbon negative or carbon neutral. So you'll see names such as AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, GSK, and Pfizer, and Lundbeck. However, all pharmaceutical companies are taking measures to decrease their carbon footprint. But in decreasing your carbon footprint, you also have to take into account the ethics perspective, right? So do we want to have less material, or do we want to treat all of our patients? Is there a way to do both? Well, in comparators, we use them both in clinical trials and in the global market. So patients are being treated in the global market for a particular compound, with a particular compound, but that same compound might also be used in clinical trials to innovate and revolutionize the industry. If this compound is in shortage, manufacturers have a major dilemma to face. Do they treat the existing patients in the global market, or do they treat the patients in the clinical trials? There's no right answer, but if the compound is in shortage, we have this dilemma. This is a chart that actually everyone here is able to see. This is taken from the FDA website, and currently there are 149 drugs in shortage today. So why do we have these drugs in shortage? You know, we might have a raw material shortage, actual resources, finite resources in the earth that might be limited, as are most things. There also might be discontinued drugs that maybe we don't have the manufacturing capacity to continue to produce. We also might have higher demand. We might be expecting demand to be X, and our demand is actually 2X due to COVID-19, for instance. And last but not least, there might be manufacturing disruptions. Companies may shut down, bigger companies may buy smaller companies, and so on, so forth. But let's take a deeper dive into oncology, something that hits home for all of us. You can see on your screen that of the 149 drugs that I just showed, 16 of which are actually for oncology. But as I said before, about 50 to 70% of drugs actually go to waste. So with 4,000 clinical trials ongoing or planned to be using these drugs, we can see that if we can reduce the waste levels, we can use more of the drugs in shortage, and we can increase the supply of clinical trials and treat the existing customers that need these compounds. To put this into perspective of how often this occurs, so let's take a look at the phase 3 clinical trials, for instance. What this is showing is the number of oncology trials that are actually using these drugs in shortage. So roughly for every 3 clinical trials that are moving into phase 3 for oncology, roughly 1 of which is using a potential drug in shortage. So that's a high likelihood that you'll be using a drug in shortage in your clinical supply chain. But we have these drugs in shortage. We talk about the ethics component, but the resource management is ultimately what defines how much capacity we'll have. And we might be sitting here thinking, oh, you know, we might have the best manufacturing capabilities. We have the best partnerships. We won't run into drug shortages. This won't happen. So let's compare this to an industry that we all know and we're all impacted with every day. Semiconductors. Semiconductors are used in almost everything you do in your day-to-day life. Everything from your phone to your computer to your car, it's used for everything. And over the past 2 to 3 years, we saw a major shortage in these semiconductors, ultimately leading to higher costs. But why did this semiconductor shortage happen? There's no one reason. This was a study done by McKinsey. There's numerous articles. If you want to go on their website, you can take a look yourself. But there was no one particular instant that caused this disruption in the supply chain. Instead, it was the 5 bubbles below that you can see. Obviously, COVID-19 influenced all of our lives. That created a limit in the number of, semiconductors available. Then there was a consolidation and a lack of new capacity. Bigger companies were buying smaller companies, and the bigger companies that were buying from these big companies became the top priority, limiting the capacity for smaller companies. There was also geopolitical tensions that affect our day-to-day lives. And then this is a big one, the overlapping chip demand. Yes, phone companies might be saying, oh, I need semiconductors, but the same car companies are also saying, we need semiconductors too. You'll see we dive into the car industry a little bit more later, but there's a lot of different companies that need these chips, as well as phone companies rolling out the 5G software, where with the 5G software, they needed more chips, and other car companies couldn't forecast that. And last but not least, there was a lack of demand planning. Ultimately, it's impossible to forecast the future, but with proper technology, you can do so in a more effective manner. But we're here for drugs, right? As you'll see in these bubbles, there's actually a lot of similarities between the semiconductor and the drug shortage industry. First and foremost, there's a finite amount of raw material. Although different than the semiconductor industry, the raw material for, say a Cancer drug might be the same for an Alzheimer's drug, and they might be competing for the same resources. Then there's also a shortage in manufacturers and CMOs. The manufacturers, there's only a finite amount of manufacturers that everyone's competing to use. We spoke with a client the other day that had to forecast 2 years in advance. Let that sink in. There's also an increased competition for the same resources, as I said with the raw materials. Raw materials, manufacturers, even people, human resources. There's an increased competition for everything. And last but not least, the investment is a finite resource. And what do we mean by that? Investors will come and they'll say, here's an X amount of money, but if they're not generating returns on that money, in the end, the investment will cease. So why make changes? Why make this change? And why not let this happen to us in the future? Amory will take you in a deep dive on how we can prevent this from happening.
Great. Thank you very much, Jake. This was a great introduction to the topic. And of course, this was a lot of information for everyone. Feel free if you have any questions, if there's any point that you were particularly interested in, to ask it in the chat, and we will take into consideration at the very end. We will make sure to answer all the questions that come towards us. Now, everything that Jake just explained to us, it's, of course, seems a bit grim, of course. We're not the only industry to suffer from it, but we are an industry in clinical supply chain that has already been facing a lot of challenges in the past years. We were already an industry that had to work with a lot of uncertainty, with a lot of complications, with very, very, well, I mean, we're talking about people's health, of course. So the challenges behind our job are just literally about life or death. We need to make sure that all our patients are supplied with drug, that drug is available at all times within the whole supply chain of the clinical trial, and that we ensure that the trials are on time, because we want to get that drug on the market for patients who are sick around the world to be able to be treated for their diseases. And before, we already had to work with minimizing waste as much as possible, working with a protocol that had already been written and where we had some constraints, work with limited manufacturing capacities, with a certain budget that was given to us. But now we're adding additional constraints and additional challenges to our job with everything that Jake exposed right now. Ethical issues on the comparator sourcing, raw material shortages, budget shortages, even more, emissions, and wanting to make clinical supply chain even more sustainable. It's just adding and piling on, right? It feels like it's a lot of problems to solve at the same time. Well, this is going to be the last bad news slide of the presentation, because the idea from now on is to think on how we can solve that, right? In the end, what we're talking about is just a very big puzzle with a lot of different pieces, and all we want to do is build that puzzle efficiently in an optimal way by tackling all of the different points. We're not alone in trying to do that. If we do a quick parallel with other industries, and we go back to the automotive industry, the car industry that Jake introduced earlier, they have, I'm not going to say similar, but they have the same kind of issues that we have in clinical supply chain. When they build a car, what do they want? They want the car to be fast, to be aerodynamic, to have low emissions, to be light, to be cheap, to be long-term, to brake easily, brake with an A, not with an E, to have low noise and vibration creation whenever it's going at high speed. So there's a lot of different problems that the car industry is trying to solve when building a single car, and even when building a single piece of the car, the windshield, the rear end window, everything on your car is actually extremely thoroughly thought about and optimized. Actually, the car industry has been using the technology of digital twins and simulations to define the shape and size and materials of all of the different parts of a car for a very long time in order to solve a huge amount of problems, just like we should be doing in clinical trials. If you look at another industry, the energy industry, for example, and this one is an interesting one for Inside because we work in the energy as well. Did you know that the European electricity market was actually connected? The grid across Europe is connected, which means that electricity produced in Germany can actually be consumed in France and Portugal. This was actually created years ago already, but Inside was tasked about a decade ago to create an algorithm to optimize the price of the exchanges of electricity in order to make sure that we could minimize as much as possible the waste of renewable sources. Why? Because if Germany produces a lot of solar and wind energy and it's not consumed, it just goes to waste, right? So if we find a way to have that electricity shipped to another country and consumed elsewhere, it avoids producing in that other country carbon-based electricity or nuclear electricity, for example. This is really what we've been all about in this industry with Enside, is to optimize that to ensure as much as possible that we are reducing the CO2 emissions of producing electricity around Europe. And side benefit, the European Union actually released a press release a couple of months ago showing that just in 2021, an additional 34 billion euros of benefits were created by this market. So not only are we solving a very big sustainability issue, but we're creating additional profits, because what you don't waste, you can sell, and therefore you're creating additional profits. Well, the solution is therefore there for us. We know that we have to consider all of the angles of the problem because there are a lot of angles in clinical supply chain, and that we want to optimize all the decisions that we're taking by quantifying them and understanding their exact impact on all of these different angles that we talked about. And the solution, I've already hinted towards it, is the digital twin or simulations, or however we want to call this. The idea is to, well, take whatever you want to make, let's say the whole clinical supply chain, for example, and you duplicate it in a virtual way. You create its exact twin digitally. Why is that interesting? Because as soon as you have a twin of your clinical trial, or anything else by the matter, you can actually start poking at it and playing with it and changing it a little bit and see how it reacts. And what happens if, let's say, you change a little thing in a protocol? What happens if you have a bit of a delay in your recruitment? What happens if you have a 2 months delay in your next release of a batch? You can test all of that in a digital twin and see years in advance the long-term repercussions of all of the decisions that you're planning to take today. But you're not disrupting your actual clinical trial by doing so. You're disrupting a virtual one, which is, of course, safe for everyone. You're not impacting real-life patients. So, of course, I mean, all of that seems quite fancy. It's a lot of buzzwords and nice technology vocabulary, the digital twin and everything. But how does it apply in real life, right? We're all working on real clinical trials with real patients behind. Well, we have worked on a couple of case studies, of course. I mean, Enside by itself, we've probably worked on maybe 10, 12,000 trials in the past decade. So we do have a lot of experience with doing this. And we're going to show here a couple of case studies on how we're going to be able to tackle all of these different angles of sustainability, of course, as well as all of the others by doing this digital twin. So the first case study for today was actually a clinical trial that happened during COVID that was aimed at treating COVID symptoms. So it was a trial that was, I think it started in 2020, so probably in the summer 2020, so right when the pandemic was hitting Europe quite hard. And they were planning to recruit about 500 patients in 90 sites in 12 countries around the world with 6 local depots. And it was going to be a very fast recruitment. Of course, there were a lot of patients that were just waiting for a treatment to cure their secondary effects of COVID. So the recruitment was planned to be very, very fast. The only problem is there was a huge shortage of the comparator drug that they were using here. Of course, patients around the world are sick. They're buying respiratory drugs to actually feel better when they have COVID. And that drug is now in shortage all around the world. So this company was able to secure only 2,300 units of that comparator, which we can think could be enough. But actually, we did build a digital twin of this trial and we simulated it. And what the system told us is, if we don't have 4,200 units of the comparator, we're going to have a risk of shortage in the clinical trial as well. Which was, well, not good news, of course. No one's happy of hearing that. We only have about half of what we need for the whole clinical trial. So what can we do? We could delay the clinical trial. We could cancel it. We could reduce the number of patients, maybe. I don't know. There's a lot of different options, but none of those are satisfactory. So what we try to do here? We went back to Enside's core business and our knowledge. For those who know us very well, you've probably seen this slide hundreds of times before. It's just a quick reminder. There are a lot of drivers of inefficiencies in clinical supply chain. And a lot of them, we actually do have control on them, and we can change them, and we can adapt them and understand the impact that those decisions have on the supply chain itself. The first one is the unexpected events. Trials are unpredictable. Recruitment can be faster, slower. Patients can survive longer or less time. They can change doses. We can have a delay in our batch. It's really hard to know what's going to happen in a trial. That's a very, very big issue with clinical trials. We never know what's going to happen, which does create inefficiencies, of course, because we need to plan for those. So planning is the second point. Planning means, quantities we're going to pack and label and source and distribute. When we're going to do that, how much are we going to package, label, and source? We're going to need to ship that drug to sites, and we're going to use an IRT system to do so most of the time. And the strategy we're going to use to resupply sites is another factor of inefficiencies, because all IRTs are different, and depending on how we configure the IRT, it can create positive or negative issues in the trial. Then, we talked about unexpected events, which is a problem per se, but another problem that we observed at Ensite very often is that even when we have an unexpected event, if there's a lack of monitoring and timely reaction, the impact of the unexpected event can be a lot worse. Here, we're talking about, let's say the recruitment's a bit faster. If you're monitoring your trial correctly, you can identify that outlier early enough to take an action and maybe plan your next deposition a bit earlier. But if you're not monitoring and you're not able to take an action in time, it might create additional inefficiencies and issues in the trial. Then we have the supply chain design, your network, your lead times to sites and to depots, and everything that is linked really specifically to the supply chain. And finally, the trial design, the protocol, the visit schedule, the country lists that we're going to go to, the design of the kit, the time at which certain pieces of data are tracked, all of that is extremely impactful as well on the supply chain. So in this specific case study, we wanted to tackle all of these different points with solutions that would help make the supply chain more efficient. And I'm not going to go through the whole list right here because we have examples to illustrate on the next slides. We came back with a bunch of ideas for this company to make the trial feasible with the 2,300 units of comparator that was available. It was a hard challenge, but we had to do it and we had to try it. So first of all, we came up with ideas that were approved right away. First, negotiating with the CMOs, lead times to sites of 2 to 4 days, instead of a typical week that it would take to get to sites. Why is that important? Because the faster you can ship, the less you need to plan for uncertainty, which means that you can minimize your buffers on the site for those who are familiar with supply chain. If you have faster lead times, you can have less buffers on your site as well because you have a better reaction time to unexpected events. We also asked them to split the dispensing into 2 visits instead of 1. Patients would be randomized and get 2 kits. Now what we're asking of them is, well, let's give them only 1 kit at randomization and 1 kit 1 week later. That way, if a patient leaves the trial, we have the second kit that we can give to someone else. And even there, we could also reduce the inventories on site and have, instead of 2 kits of buffer, only 1 kit of buffer on the site. We also asked to change the visit window to make that feasible. And overall, you can see it reduced the total drug needs from 4,200 to 3,500. It was a first step. It was already quite successful. So through the building of the digital twin, we actually modeled these different solutions, these 3 solutions that I mentioned now. And what the model told us, the simulations told us is, well, if you do all of that, you only need 3,500 units of drug to not have any shortage and risk. It was good. It was a good start. But we had other ideas that we brought that were a bit more controversial, like reducing the number of countries and depots, reducing the number of sites, which would slow down the recruitment, of course. Maybe instead of having a competitive enrollment like it was the case today, asked them to have local targets. And let me explain that very quickly. Because if you have Russia and Mexico in the same clinical trial and you have an active and a comparator treatment arm and the randomization ratio is 1-to-1, if the recruitment is competitive on a global level, it means that you can end up having only patients on active in Mexico and only patients on the comparator in Russia. It is unlikely, of course, but it is possible. And an imbalance of patients on both treatment arms in a single depot is likely to happen. That is true. But if you did have local targets and have randomization blocks per region, you would be able to say that in Russia, all the patients are randomized on a 1-to-1 ratio in Russia specifically, which means that you're very likely to actually have the same amount of patients on both arms in that country. Why is that positively impactful for us? Because if you don't have to plan for the uncertainty of having a 70-30 split in Russia, but you know you're going to be very close to 50-50, your depot shipments have to cover for a lower uncertainty. And so you can ship less drug to those depots, and so you can save a lot of drug as well. And the last solution, quite controversial as well, was to cap weekly site recruitment. What do we mean by that? Well, typical site in competitive recruitment can recruit as many patients as they want within a week. Here, we're telling them you can't recruit more than 2 patients a week. Why? Because we're going to give you a certain amount of buffers on your site, because we don't have a lot of drug available. And that drug is going to allow you to recruit 2 patients per week, no more. And it's quite interesting to see that it was one of the first times we worked on a clinical trial where limiting recruitment was actually increasing recruitment speed overall, because by doing this, we were able to keep drug at the depot and actually enable the initial timelines for recruitment. Because even if you had 90 sites recruiting 2 patients a week, you would be done with the 500 patients within a month or 2, no problems asked. So here, by limiting recruitment capacity on a site level, we're actually enabling the trial as a whole to recruit as fast as they expected. Here's a quick illustration of these 4 additional scenarios and a combination of all of them that we've tested out in our simulations. You can see here that on the left side, you have the amount of depots. So the lower the amount of depots, the more feasible are the scenarios. As you can see, the boxes are green when the scenario is feasible. If we have a competitive recruitment, there's a lot more red boxes than if we have regional targets. Once again, because with regional targets, we're able to ensure that a depot shipment can have equal amounts of active and placebo and not have too much overage on top of that to cover the uncertainty of the imbalance. Then, if we capped or uncapped the recruitment, you can see that when we have a capped recruitment of 2 patients per week, we are allowing a lot more of the scenarios as well. Overall, we did test a lot of different scenarios. Use a quick summary of all of these scenarios on a graph with the danger line of 2,300 units of comparator there that you can see in blue on the graph. Everything above is unfeasible due to the unavailability of the comparator. Everything below is feasible. And then it was up to the team to decide which of these scenarios to implement within, of course, feasibility. The conclusion was quite positive because by doing that, we were able to keep the timelines on track. So the trial happened as planned. They didn't have to slow down recruitment, even though they had to choose not to go into certain countries they wanted to go to initially. Drug waste was down by 32% on both the comparator and the active. All patients were treated, no problems. But they were, on top of that, able to re-inject 320 units of comparator into the market because we made the trial feasible with 1,980 units. So they were able to resell some of that and give it back to the market just because we were able to make the trial feasible with less. So they actually did something quite ethical. They gave back drug to patients who needed it. It reduced inventories on site by 29%. The number of vials that were packed, labeled, and shipped was down by 34%, as well as the shipments to sites, and total cost of supply by 30%. So it's okay. It seems quite big numbers, but it's a reality because we're tackling here decisions outside of the supply chain. You saw we were actually tackling a lot of things that are happening in the protocol itself. But we do have another case study. Case study number 2 is actually an oncology trial here. We're talking about a trial with 900 patients for a biosimilar using also chemotherapies as a standard of care. 150 sites, 4 local depots, 2 years of recruitment. And if we focus on the left side of the screen here, we have a couple of challenges. The biosimilar is weight-based dispensed. The chemotherapies are body surface area-based dispensed. And there's also a choice of the investigator of which chemotherapy, carboplatin or cisplatin, the patient is going to be on. We don't know which one the investigator is going to choose, but there's a choice. In the observations that we made, well, the biosimilar was quite expensive, was $6,000 a unit, but the chemotherapies, the carboplatin and the cisplatin, were quite cheap. It's $30 to $50 a unit. Thing is, platinum, which is the base raw material used to make carboplatin and cisplatin, it's in the main platin, is actually a material that is really hard to extract from the earth and available in very limited amounts, which means that it's not infrequent to have global stockouts of carboplatin and cisplatin around the world. But the problem is, due to the very high cost of the biosimilar and the very low cost of chemotherapies, what we observe in oncology trials, as Jake explained earlier, is that there's not too much of an incentive to reduce the waste of chemotherapies because it's not saving a lot of money, unfortunately. On the other hand, due to the fact that we don't know what the patient's body surface area is going to be or the investigator's choice is going to be, pharma companies tend to prefer to over forecast the amounts of chemotherapies in order to be safe and ensure that they don't have any risks of shortages, because of course it's unethical to not have a drug for an oncology patient when they come to a hospital. It's absolutely unimaginable. But in order to balance that risk, we typically overproduce. In this specific case study, a couple of assumptions had been taken by the pharma company that, for example, all patients would consume both chemotherapies, that the investigator's choice and the patient's body surface area would only be known at randomization. They also took the assumptions that all patients would consume 4 kits of the cisplatin and 5 kits of the carboplatin at every cycle, and that all patients would have 6 cycles of chemotherapy. The demand that was calculated by our system with these assumptions is the one that you can see on the right. So 27,000 units of carboplatin and 21,000 of cisplatin, plus an optimized overage of 9%, quite low. But the problem is, if we take a deep look at these assumptions, a lot of them are actually false. Patients cannot consume both. Carboplatin and cisplatin are both a platinum-based chemotherapy, but you can't use both at the same time. It's one or another. And we could actually know that information already at screening and not have to wait for randomization, making that predictable, actually. If we change the protocol to make the body surface area and the investigator choice tracked at the screening, that would make it a lot more efficient. Finally, we also know that, well, they're both body surface area based. So no, not all patients are going to take 4 and 5 kits of each. They're going to take a certain amount that is based on their weight or their body surface. Finally, this is an oncology trial, so there is going to be a dropout. So not all patients are actually going to do 6 cycles. Some of them might do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's expected that only 20% of the patients, that 20% of the patients will not reach the full 6 cycles because they will drop out of the trial before that. If we change these assumptions and use the assumptions that are now on the left, which is data that we have from previous clinical trial we worked on with these same comparators, and that we also tell that patients can take one or another and that we can track the information at screening, you can see that we're going from an original demand of 27,000 of carboplatin to 12,000 instead. It's a huge difference. On the cisplatin, the difference is even bigger. We're going down to 9,800 units bought here. Is there cost savings linked to that? Yes, of course there's cost savings. But the most important thing, as these drugs are very often in shortage, and if you go on the FDA list, the carboplatin has been quite in shortage in the past 4 years, this is ethical. This is absolutely ethical to be able to forecast your demand in a clinical trial accurately, because 10,000 units of carboplatin, it could be the demand of France for 2 or 3 months. And not having that drug available could make a lot of patients get out of their treatment for weeks or months at a time. It could disrupt their treatment for cancer, and they could really have very bad long-term negative impact of this. So what are the take-home messages that we have from this presentation? And well, once again, feel free to ask some questions. I see that there's already a couple of questions on the chat. As soon as we're done with the take-home messages, we're going to go through the questions and answer them. So please feel free to write them down on the chat. We'll be happy to go through them. But now let's go through the take-home messages. As Jake explained at the beginning, sustainability is becoming a huge priority for a lot of pharmaceutical companies. And there's a lot of ways to do that, to make our clinical trials more sustainable. You could try to work with carbon neutral suppliers, of course, that's the first step, selecting your suppliers to have suppliers, CMOs, manufacturing companies that are also carbon neutral. You could try to have more sustainable material sources or energy sources or sustainable mining. You can work to innovate in packaging, like reusing, for example, electronic packaging or reusable packaging, innovate in transportation and manufacturing to reduce also the carbon footprint, or you can pay for carbon offset, which is typically quite expensive as well. But all of these actions, they're time consuming, it's long-term goals, and the immediate impact is quite low. The second angle, the second way to look at this is, well, in our whole clinical supply chain, 50 to 70% of our supplies are actually wasted. So even if we're taking all of the actions on the left, we are taking these actions for drug that might be wasted at the end. Of course, both go hand in hand. We need to do both, of course, but one easy thing to do right away is try to tackle that waste. Because those drugs, as Jake explained, are manufactured, they're shipped around the world, and then they're destroyed because they're wasted, they're not consumed by patients. So if we're able to reduce the global global waste on clinical trials, we can also impact positively the shortages of raw materials that these drugs use. We could make less transportation, less packaging and labeling, less CO2 produced when destroying the drug. Typically, what we like to say is that a sustainable kit is a kit that does not exist. It's a kit that we did not have to produce. And all of these things also allow you to have less cost, which means that you can reinvest into research. It's not rare that we have projects where we save so much drug and so much budget that they are reinvested into other clinical trials, into other research, or into accelerating recruitment onto those specific programs. So I would invite everyone in the call here today to consider these two angles. They're both important. They're both things that we need to do, all of us, and we need to work together to do it. But working on waste is something that can be done immediately because technology exists to do so. And so, Jake, I'll hand it over for your conclusion slide.
So just as we had with the semiconductor industry, it's not a one-time thing. It's not one thing that can be done. Rather, it's a whole plethora of things that need to be done in order for us to achieve this common goal. The first of which is we need to make informed data-driven decisions. And we don't just need a lot of data, but we need a lot of good data. And we need to make the best decisions on that data as possible. How do we do that? We use the right tools and we optimize based on this data. So if we have bad data coming in, we're going to get bad data coming out. And we need to use the right tools to optimize and achieve our common goals. By doing all of this, this will give you a realistic overview of your supply chain. So you'll be able to forecast better and you'll be able to have better results and have a more green impact on our world. And last but not least, by having all of these measures, you're able to collaborate with other parties involved and able to, again, achieve that common goal that we're all looking to strive for. Again, I'm happy that everyone was able to join today. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You'll see here that we have a bit of a QR code. And on this QR code, it will take you to a landing page where we can give you a free test of one of your trials and a bit of a waste analysis associated with that, sticking with the sustainability.
Yeah. I mean, we understand that every number that we showed you today can seem quite, impressive, first of all. Maybe you're a bit skeptical about those, but these are real life case studies. We work on hundreds of these every year. So we're very confident that we could show that to you on one of your clinical trials, which is why we're taking this initiative here to propose a free test of our technology on one of your trials. So if you're interested, just reach out to us or going to that link. We'd be happy to have a discussion about that with you. And actually, I think now is the most interesting part of the talk. So I'm going to welcome Peggy back for the Q&A.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you, Anne-Marie. Excellent, excellent content. I think I even learned a few things from this. So thank you both so much. And looking into the questions, I'd really like to have some questions answered. I will recite them on behalf. So our first question is, do we have any idea how this is also impacted in human biosample kits? Can you both speak on behalf of that?
Yes. So the technology that we are using right now and that we presented today is specifically tailored for clinical drug supply chain and not for the sampling supply chain. Although for biosample kits, the supply chain is the same, right? We're still packaging and labeling those kits, shipping them to depots and then to sites. And it's quite interesting that you have that question, because we have learned in the past years that the waste on biosample kits is actually higher than the waste on drug. It's close to 70, 80% sometimes with some of the companies we talked with. We could use the same technology on the biosample kits because it exists as well. And we are actually building a plugin into our system to support the biosample kits. So if you're interested in discussing that further, please let us know. After the webinar, you can reach out to us. We'd be happy to discuss that into more details.
Excellent. Thank you so much. In addition to this, I have another question. Is there a carbon footprint of using a digital twin, and how much lower is that?
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting question. So like using any technology or any computer-based software, it means we need to use, we need to store the data somewhere. We need to use web services to do so. And maintaining those servers active, of course, has a certain carbon cost. Depending on how the electricity is produced, if it's wind, solar electricity, or nuclear electricity, then the carbon footprint of keeping those systems alive is very low. If we're using those in a country where the electricity is produced with coal or petrol or gas, then the sustainability is going to have it's going to be quite negative. So using this digital twin technology is going to consume whatever any software consumes, or even your inbox or emails consumes also for the data that is stored. It's going to depend on how much data you want to keep on it, how many trials you're using it for, how much you clean the data after you've used it. It's really depending on a lot of different assumptions that were taken. But honestly and realistically, the amount of carbon produced by storing data is a lot lower than the amount of carbon that is created by transporting drug all around the world. So it's really not comparable, I would say.
Additionally, from an inside perspective, as a B Corp we have a B Corp certification, and I think it's important to recognize that although we focus on the drug shortage aspect in this presentation as a whole, there are also other ways in which we can optimize the sustainability. So another thing that we do is we look at shipping and how many site shipments we need, or how many depot shipments we may need. So contributing to other factors that also play a role in a company's carbon footprint is very crucial, not just on the drug side of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you both for those very in-depth and thorough answers. I really appreciate it. We do have some time for a couple other questions. Here's one. I personally found this pretty intriguing. How can you bring down waste without increasing risk for your patients? Can you guys talk about that?
It's a very frequent question, isn't it? It's always the question, right? If knowing how uncertain clinical trials are, it's very frequent to ask ourselves that question. If we reduce waste, and typically, let's not call it waste, let's call it overage, let's call it safety stock, let's call it however we want. We need that. We need to have a certain amount of safety stock in a clinical trial because without it, there's very, very high chances that due to all the disruptions that happen, we're going to have a risk. Now, what is that overage amount? What is that safety stock amount? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. Very often, like in the examples that we showed, a lot of the waste is created by bad demand planning. So the fact that we're not able to correctly calculate the accurate demand that we're actually going to have, or by the unexpected events, or by the lack of reactivity to those unexpected events, or by strategic decisions that are taken in the protocol very, very early on. So we're not talking here about reducing the necessary, safety amount of waste that we need to have. We're talking about changing all of the environment of the clinical trial in order for this specific safety to be able to be lower than what we need today. That's what we're looking at. So our system is always going to optimize the waste or the overage as an output of its simulations, and that output is the lowest possible waste that you need in order to cover all of the risks. So what we're going to try to do is work on the decisions that are taken in the clinical trial itself to make that safety stock as low as possible, basically. I hope it's clear enough and that I answer your question.
Yeah, excellent. So to challenge you guys a little bit more, kind of put you on the spot, another question that came up: how is it possible that you can decrease costs everywhere? So if you decrease waste, shipment costs generally increase. Can you guys elaborate on that a bit more?
It's quite funny because the answer is going to be similar to the previous one, right? Indeed, if in a clinical trial you want to reduce your waste by changing the IRT configuration, you're going to increase the number of shipments, because it means you're going to ship more frequently to the sites to keep your drug at the depot and have better control on your stocks. So typically that's what happens. But if you start looking at decisions outside of supply chain, there are decisions that you can take that will reduce everything at the same time. If we go back to our case study, just a couple of examples right there, reducing the number of depots, reducing the number of sites. You're not going to do that on every trial, of course, but those two things reduce both the shipments and the waste. If you change your visit schedule, you're going to reduce both your waste and your shipments as well. I mean, not all the time, but in some cases it might happen. If you change your IRT vendor to an IRT vendor that has a better algorithm, you might be decreasing both as well. And it's just a different way of thinking, right? Not all is black and white all the time. There are decisions that are taken that can have a massive impact on the whole scope. And yes, we talked about waste and shipments, but remember that the main impact here is sustainability, right? When we decrease the waste, we're actually allowing patients to get more drug. When we're reducing shipments, we're actually reducing CO2 emissions. So I think that's what we have to keep in mind. There are ways, and it's the good news, right? There are ways to tackle every problem at the same time. We just need to find them, right? And that is feasible with digital twins.
Yeah, and to build on that, we typically tend to think of waste from a fiscal perspective, right? We tend to think of it only for money, but from the ethical perspective as well. As we're discussing the clinical trials, I don't know if we can pull up the slide quickly, but there's also the regular global market that's using these same comparators. And it's important to make sure that all patients are treated as quickly, safely, and timely as possible. So by mitigating this waste, we can also treat more people and expand the breadth of the drug.
Excellent. Thank you both. You both spoke a little bit about emissions, and you also used a keyword, impact. We're all looking for impact in every single way, shape, or form. This is a good segue. So how do you calculate the impact on emissions?
Yeah, it's one from the discussions we've been having in the past years at conferences about sustainability and emissions. You might know a lot of companies have created teams to focus specifically on that. And what I see as being one of the main actions that those teams are taking right now is actually first to get visibility, right? We need to understand what's going on today. How much emission is a shipment costing from the US to Germany? How much is a shipment from Brazilian depot to that specific site in Brazil? How much is the emissions of manufacturing that specific drug in that specific machine in that specific country? Typically, I'm going to tell you honestly, I have no idea. I don't think anyone in the world actually has an idea of the total full emissions of their supply chain, because if we go as far as raw material extraction from the earth, that produces a lot of CO2, of course, and other kinds of issues. But the machines that are being used to do that, they've been manufacturing themselves, and there was emissions created in manufacturing the machine. So how far do you go into taking all of that into consideration, right? Do you even take into consideration the CO2 emissions of your employees going to their offices? Honestly, how do you do it? It's about defining a rule and setting that rule internally within your company. Okay, this is the rule we're going to use, because if we try to get to the last carrot, we're never going to do it. I think that's an important lesson first. We can take assumptions as well. I think typically we can take assumptions that are close enough to the reality that we can already do some modeling like what we're presenting today and have an impact, right? If we assume that a shipment is 500 grams of CO2 and the reality is 484, honestly, we're good enough with 500 if it takes us, I don't know, 80% less time for us to define that value, right? So defining the impact on emissions first needs us to either take assumptions or have data available. And then it's very easy. Well, on our side, we have as an output the whole shipment schedule for the whole trial. We have the whole packaging and manufacturing schedule for the whole trial. So all we have to do is multiply the amount of events by the CO2 emission and compare that across scenarios to understand how each of the scenarios are impacting these things.
Spoken like a true expert.
Yeah, I do tend to speak a lot. I hope it was clear.
No, I mean, speaking on behalf of everybody else that's on the webinar, like, I think your answers, both you and Jake, are very thorough, very honest in your answers. So I greatly appreciate that. That concludes us for our questions. Again, we want to thank you all so much for joining, and we certainly look forward to you joining our next webinar. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everyone. And if some questions were left unanswered, we will follow up by email. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.